All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Sean with the Strategic Wealth Network. I wanted to real quickly drill down on taxes because they are such a huge portion of our wealth where we transfer that wealth to the government. And there are strategies and ways to avoid that and capture that money and keep that in your personal economy instead of that money transferring unnecessarily or unknowingly in a lot of cases to the government. All right, now there's a lot going on with this chart, but essentially what this chart is a chart of the average top tax brackets in the United States since 1913. Income tax was essentially started or began back in 1913, and it was really just a way to pay for the war. You can see that the top bracket was 7% for income earners of $500,000 or more. Okay, realistically that was only supposed to happen for 1 year, but you can see that after a few years Congress just got hooked on this new tax revenue, and at that point it was just off to the races. All right, we can see that during World War II, tax rates were increased astronomically to 77% was the highest bracket in 1918 during World War I. It was for income earners that were making over $1 million or more, but still 77% of their wealth went to the government, meaning they only kept or captured 23% of their money. Okay, then you can see that the next year in 1919, they lowered the tax bracket to 73%. So it was lowered from 77 down to 73% for income earners of $1 million or more. But watch this. You can see that throughout history, when tax rates have been lowered, for example, in 1922, the top tax bracket was lowered down to 58%, but you can see that the threshold was on income earners of $200,000 or more. So instead of just lowering the tax liability across the board, what they did was lowered the top bracket, but included a lot more people in that mix. They just widened the net, capturing a lot more revenue in the process. Then you can see the taxes were dramatically lowered for most Americans to 43.5% on income earners over $200,000 or more. They were increased to 46% the next year, but the threshold was bumped up to $500,000. So if you made $500,000 or more, you saw a dramatic increase in your tax rate. All right. Then again, the tax rates were lowered in the 20s. During the roaring 20s, when money was generated like crazy, wealth was being generated at an alarming pace, the top tax bracket was lowered down to 25%. But you can see the threshold was also lowered to income earners of $100,000 or more. So it included a lot more Americans at the time. All right. Then we can see that during the stock market crash of 1929, the brackets remained the same, 25% for income earners of $100,000 or more. And in 1932, you can see that it dramatically increased again to 63% for income earners of $1 million or more. It stayed that way for quite some time until they raised it again to almost 80% for income earners of $5 million or more. You can see that that happened in 1941, and then in 1942, you'll notice that they dropped the threshold from $5 million to $200,000 and increased the tax rate. So it went from collecting 81% of tax for income earners of $5 million or more to collecting 88% tax on people who made $200,000 or more in 1942. That's 1 year. That's a significant change in our tax code. And you can see why. It was because we had this run up to World War II. Anytime countries have a run up to war, you're going to see a lot of deficit spending, and they've got to increase the tax base to pay for that deficit spending. The highest bracket that we saw was back in 1944, and it was 94% for income earners of $200,000 or more. So think about that for a second. If you made more than $200,000 back then, you only kept 6% of your income. The rest of your money went to the government. Then tax rates changed and fluctuated again. During the Korean War, tax rates were at 92%. They bumped the threshold up to $400,000. They stayed that way for quite some time. And then you can see when JFK was president, they lowered the threshold to $200,000 again. It went from $400,000 to $200,000, and they dropped the rate again from 91% to 70%. All right, then we had the Vietnam War, and you can see they raised the rate again to 77% on income earners of 200,000 or more. And then it stayed that way for quite some time during the 70s. You know, they played around with the threshold a little bit. It was $200,000 in 1976. Then the next year it bumped up to 203. Then it bumped up to 215 in 1979 and stayed that way for a few years. They dropped it to 69% from 70. And then it dropped down to 50% in 1982 on income earners of $85,000 or more. So you can see the threshold dropped from 215,000 in income to 85,000 in income. Yes, they lowered the rate substantially, but they broadened the base. They collected taxes at the highest level from more income earners. All right, and you can see this is during the Reagan presidency. Reagan cut the bracket significantly, went from 50% to 38%, then down to 28% for the top bracket of income earners. But look what he did to the threshold. The threshold was also lowered. If you made more than $29,750 in 1988, you were considered extremely wealthy and you were taxed at the highest rates. So virtually everyone in the United States was paying the highest rates during the 80s. Then you can see we had the Gulf War. We had to pay for that, so they bumped the rate from 28% to 31%, and they also increased the threshold. This is when we started to see a lot of different income tax brackets forming. There used to be only a handful of brackets. There were basically a small, lower income earners, medium income earners, and then higher income earners. But when they made these changes in the 90s, they really broadened the base a lot more. You can see that during Bill Clinton's administration, tax rates were increased to 39%, but they also increased the threshold to $250,000. So if you made $250,000 or more, you were considered wealthy and you were in the highest tax bracket. Okay, he did lower it substantially and raise the threshold, broadening the base again, broadening that tax revenue to the central government. And then when Bush took over, he substantially cut the tax rate. All right, he maintained that threshold, played around with it a little bit, but he lowered the tax rate on the highest income earners. Now you can see that today the income tax rate has increased to 39.6%, and the threshold is increased to $450,000. So now if you make more than $450,000, you're considered extremely wealthy in the U.S. and you're taxed at the highest rates. All right. The reason I bring this up is specifically because you need to determine what tax bracket are you in. All right. And you got to also think, if you're in that tax bracket, how does that affect your future income? I don't know about you, but I think if you asked 100 people on the street, based on the fact that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid A through D are completely insolvent, do you believe that tax rates are going up, down, or staying the same in the future? What do you think most people would say? All right. I also want to draw your attention to this because, the law of nature tells us when anything gets too far away from the mean, or this median line that we have here, this mean tends to pull things back. It typically overshoots the mean and then has to revert back towards the mean, overshooting or snapping back again. You can see that both positively and negatively. That affects tax rates both positively and negatively. When tax rates are too low, below that median line, they snap back and they overshoot. They had been way too high for a long, long period of time, and so the government, realized that and started to lower things, which forced them to snap back below that median line and overshoot again. So the direction of tax rates based on historical averages and current problems with federal spending, with these federally controlled government programs, I think tax rates are going up in the future. And so you can see what effect that has to your retirement accounts. If you're deferring those taxes for a future date, What that essentially means is the government is going to get more and more of your share of the account, and you're going to get less of your account. All right, the average account balance in a 401k, IRA, and mutual fund today is roughly around $250,000. So out of that total account, your share is only $175,000 if you're in that 30% tax bracket when you pull your money out. But if your tax bracket skyrockets back to anywhere close to the norm or the median line, that 59% average that we've seen, you can see that those numbers flip-flop. If your average account balance is $250,000 in the future and tax rates have skyrocketed, then your share of that account is only $102,000. Uncle Sam's share is $147,000. So again, we got to ask, how much sense does it make to defer taxes in those 401ks, IRAs, and qualified government plans when we know that taxes are going up in the future?